Sardonyx is? Sardonyx is a stone that is layered in colors, and almost all old cameos are sardonyx. And what you do is you carve the figure in the top color and then leave the color behind. When cameos that are made today oftentimes are, two things put together, but historically they weren't. Historically they were always made from this stone, from Sardis. And the stone itself has layers of white, and most of the other layers are reddish, almost a brick red. But if you look at old cameos, that's the way they'll look. If they take the brick red and cut it very thin, it tends to look more and more red, okay? But the thicker it gets, the darker it gets. So anyway, Sardis was one of those. So, to the angel of the church of Sardis write. Now, remind you that the angel of the church is the bishop of the particular church. It says, "These are the words of the one who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your works. You have the name of being alive, although you are dead." If you've been following in these particular, letters, this is the first time works are ever condemned, okay? They're condemned sometimes for not doing works, but this is the first time that what they're about is bad. They're doing works, but the works are condemned. And he says, you have the name of being alive, but you're dead. The idea is that you appear differently than you really are. He says, wake up and put some backbone into what still survives, if only at the point of death. And this particular community, as a religious community, is in the estimation of the angel. This community is in fact dying. He says, I have found no work of yours perfect in the sight of my God. And one of the things to understand here is that when you talk about doing works, and this is not morality. In morality, every work is either good or bad, okay? But when we look at doing works generically, we normally talk of works as being good, indifferent, or bad. And the idea here is that there are no works that are seen as perfect in the sight of God. So nothing is really judged as really good. He says, be mindful, therefore, of what you have received and heard. Heed it, repent. If you do not wake up, I will come as a thief, and you will not know the hour of my coming. This refers actually to the fall of Sardis. Sardis was an extremely protected place. Sardis, have you ever heard the expression rich as Croesus? That Croesus was king of Sardis, and he was the wealthiest man historically who ever lived. And built the city. It was amazingly well protected. And the thing that was interesting about it was that it was conquered only twice in history, and both times it was conquered by stealth. Someone secretly let in the enemy in order to take over the city. And so this idea of you do not know the hour of my coming actually refers to the way the city fell both times. And it's a warning that the church can fall the same way. Remember, these letters are written to the church. They use the city as a backdrop, but they're concerned about problems in the church, not problems in the city. He says, yet you have a few persons in Sardis who have not defiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. And several of these cities we mentioned were rather famous for the production of clothing, particularly wool clothing. And this was one as well. So this is probably a reference to that. He says, the victor will likewise be robed in white. I will never strike the victor's name from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Remember, the specific thing that Jesus talks about in the scriptures about having your name acknowledged before the angels is that you and I must acknowledge his name on earth, so that everyone who acknowledges his name on earth Jesus will acknowledge that name in the presence of the Father. Okay? He says, you have ears, so listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Okay? A little bit about Sardis. I mentioned it was rich. And one of the reasons it's rich is there was a river that flowed through the area in which they found gold. And I don't know if you know the history of gold, but for a long time they found gold in rivers. And they used to basically, pan for gold until some genius figured out that it had to get in the river from somewhere. So I have no idea when that happened in history, but if you know the California history, as soon as they found gold in a river, they would go up the river trying to find where it was being brought out of the mountain, and then that's where the gold mines went. Okay, and that's ultimately where they really made the money, was out of the mines. But this place, they had a lot of gold in the river, and the city was conquered twice by stealth. The main thing that's called that this church has somehow, moved away from the gospel or whatever, but this particular church is not practicing at all, not really functioning as a church. And you noticed in the others where they talked about, things need to be corrected and there's this good and this bad and this sort of thing. We don't hear anything good here, And they say there are a few that haven't fallen into all the problems, but just a few. And remember, one of the basic teachings, if you read the Jewish scriptures, one of the basic teachings is the idea of the remnant, so that if everything's wrong, it's never all wrong. There are good people there. But the remnant is a whole theology, because if everything appears to be good, you need to know there's evil there somewhere too. That's something to know about a personal life. Your life is never so good, there's no evil. And no one's life is ever so bad, there isn't good to recover. And that's something to know about. That's called the remnant theology. Okay? And so this community is really condemned, not as much as the last one will be, but it is condemned as a community because having received the gospel, they really are not doing much with it. The next one is to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a missionary city. I'm trying to think of one in Israel. Do you remember the Decapolis? When they mention the Decapolis, the cures that take place? Jesus performed several cures in the Decapolis. The Decapolis are 10 cities, dipolis, and they're Greek cities. One of the things the Greeks used to do was the Greeks would send out small groups of Greeks, and they would go and establish a city. And if you had ever seen a Greek city, the Greeks, the cities they established, they would put a forum in the center. The ruins of Rome are a Greek city. They followed the Greek model. But they have a forum in the center with a temple, and then they have the government on one side, and they have the market on the other that goes down, and the courts on the other. And so they set up a thing like this in the center, a forum, the Roman forum, and then all the streets are laid out in grid work. Absolutely unlike San Francisco, okay? So they go out like this. And the Greeks were convinced that once someone saw a Greek city, they would never use the other kind of cities. And that's really true. The Greek city became the model for the Roman cities and became the model ultimately for cities all over the world. And when we think of the Greeks, I don't know if we think in terms of the Greeks considered themselves intellectually the highest that a human being could achieve. And they were very much into the intellectual and all this sort of thing. And they really wanted to make that the model throughout the world. And one of the reasons why Alexander's thing worked so well, Alexander's kingdom, is not because of his conquests that he conquered, but most people would conquer, loot, and get out. Well, he Hellenized. He would Hellenize areas, and so they would adopt the Greek culture. And it's very much like, if I were to use the example today, the United States colonizes the entire world, but we don't do it by building cities. We do it by TV. And so if you go anywhere in the world, like when I was in the Soviet Union, for instance, back when there was a Soviet Union, The interesting thing is everyone wanted Marlboro cigarettes. And it's because of the ads on TV. Even people who were smoking Russian cigarettes carried them in a Marlboro package. It was immediately identifiable as an American thing. When I went over there, I told the people who were traveling with me, each person should take 2 cartons of cigarettes, which was what you were allowed to do. And no one in the group smoked. And so I took all these cigarettes, and anytime we went into a hotel, when we went to dinner, I put 2 packs of cigarettes on each of the tables we were at. The waiters would do anything for free. They just brought things to the table, you know. A pack of Marlboro cigarettes in the equivalent of American money sold for $60 because it was against law to import them. So, you know, it was like holding a Fabergé, cigarette holder. So anyway, the Greeks did it by these cities, and Philadelphia was one of these cities. Philadelphia was a city that was established according to the Greek setup and everything in the hopes that other cities would pick that up. And one of the big things that Jesus, with regards to the Decapolis, one of the great problems the Jewish community was suffering from was this great influx of Greek culture, because the Greek culture really moved people away from the whole idea of Judaism. And so the Greek culture was all tied up with their gods, and it was tied up with gods, and it was tied up with philosophy, and it was also tied up with athletics. And so they really drew people in all kinds of ways. So anyway, Philadelphia is one of these cities. He says, "To the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David." One of the great prophecies of the end times, of the coming of the Messiah, was that the Messiah would be the Clavis David, the key of David. And the key of David, a key in the ancient world represented power, because, you know, they used to have gates of a city that you walk. You know, now they give you the key to the city. It fits nothing, okay? So the idea is that at those times, the key was really the sign of power. So it was a symbol of the power being returned to the leaders in Israel, the power in Israel itself. And it says, "Who opens and none may shut, who shuts and none may open." They had a disastrous earthquake. They have a lot of earthquakes, but they had a disastrous earthquake in the 1st century, shortly before this book was written. And much of these areas were really destroyed. The Roman Empire sent money to restore all of the cities, except one was so rich it refused the money. But all the others, you know, took the money and rebuilt the cities because the whole thing was disastrous. But the thing that was interesting about Philadelphia was a large city, and they had the quake. A lot of damage done, everything. But afterquakes continued for about 15 years. And so the population of Philadelphia, I think you know that after a quake, a lesser quake can bring down everything because everything's cracked and broken. So that was what was going on in Philadelphia, and the population in Philadelphia lived outside the city, and you would go into your house to get something and come out of the city because they had these aftershocks and things were coming down all the time. And that's this reference to shuts and no one opens. Like basically the quake shut the city, and there was no person who could open the city. And when the quake stopped, then the city was opened, you know, and this sort of thing. So he says, "I know your works. Therefore, I have set before you an open door which no one can shut." This idea of the open door comes out of the Pauline literature and is a reference to missionary work. Paul had a great attitude to life, and it'd be a wonderful thing if a person can inculcate it. But what Paul did was see the will of God woven into the events that go on. And I'll give you an example. Paul arrived at a port. He was on his way to a set area to do missionary work. He arrived at a port, and the ship that he was supposed to take had left in the morning, and he didn't get in there in time to take it. But there was a ship leaving in the afternoon that went to another city. And so Paul took it, went to the other city, and did the missionary work successfully. But when you look at his letters, he said, God closed the door to me to such and such, and simultaneously opened the door to such and such. So, I would sit there and sulk until the next boat left for where I wanted to go, But not Paul. Paul had none of that. He says, this is God's way of telling me I'm supposed to go here. And because of that, in literature now, we always refer to the open door as a sign of faith, that God opens an area where a person can go in as a missionary. And one of the things when you study about missionary work, that God, prepares people oftentimes through like a good example would be Native Americans, both up in Canada. They're called the First Nation. Here we call them Native Americans, and then through South America and Central America as well. The speed with which those people were converted was just remarkable. The only thing you could compare it to would be the spread of a disease, to be honest. It went through just fantastic. And part of it was their religious practices prepared them for Christianity. They believed in some kind of three ways of looking at God that prepared them for the Trinity. They believed in prophets. They believed that the gods would send missionaries to them. One of the basic things of Christianity is you and I can't reach God. You have to let God come to you. God decides when the relation. Native Americans held that. And so this whole thing, they were very well prepared. And many areas are like that. And oftentimes we have missionaries go into a country. One of the interesting things is Japan. We've been doing missionary work in Japan since the 1600s. And do you know that there are more Japanese Catholics in Brazil than there are in Japan? The church has never really taken off there for whatever reason. And yet when the church went into China, it just spread fantastically, And I use those two examples because they both have the basic Buddhism as their, thing, and yet the change. Very interesting. So anyway, this idea, he says, I have set before you an open door, missionary city. So he sets before them a chance to do missionary work. He says, which no one can shut. He says, though you have little power, you have kept my word and have not disowned my name. Okay? So he's talking about the difficulties that they went through and the difficulties they're going through now. He says, therefore, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who claim to be Jews and are not, but lie. Therefore, I will make them come and fall at your feet, and they will know that I love you. One of the things that was going on in Philadelphia, as many of the other cities, was the persecution of the Jews. And the Jewish people persecuted the Christians largely because they figured the Christians were Jews that were not living up to their responsibility. And when the Romans began persecutions of the Christian community, it's the Jews who knew who all the Christians were. And so their persecution was a part of the thing. But one of the things that the scriptures are constantly maintaining, and it's something for you and I to remember, that what they're doing is condemning the Jews for the persecution of the Christians. But what's really going on there is God is condemning believers for persecuting another believer because they don't believe what you believe. Okay? And I think you know that, like, Germany is an example where we returned the favor. But the idea is, if you look through history, it's remarkable how often believing people are persecuted by someone who simply holds another belief. And the difference between people of belief is minuscule. The difference between people who believe and don't believe is catastrophic. But usually people who don't believe just stand off and watch us kill one another. They work to, it's something really to remember. But the condemnation here is that a believer will persecute a believer. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but if you study the American Indian Wars in the United States, you know that the Americans never really engaged the Native Americans. What the Americans would do would be wait until a battle broke out between two tribes, and they did endlessly. But as soon as a battle broke out between two tribes, the American government would arm the weaker tribe, always getting the weaker one to win until they'd really destroyed the whole business. And oftentimes I think that in the initial persecutions in the Soviet Union, that's what they played. They played, the Orthodox against the Jews, against the Catholics, against this sort of thing. And anyway, it goes on today. So to understand that. But he says, because you've kept my word of endurance, I will in turn keep you safe through the hour of testing, which is about to fall on the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. So he says, I'm going to keep you safe through this. And I want you to understand, when he says that I will keep you safe, he's not talking about physically safe. Like you remember that one of the things Jesus will say to the apostles, he says, I will protect you when this persecution begins. Many of you will die. Well, what kind of protection is that? But the idea is he's going to protect their endurance in faith. Okay? Whether or not you die on the face of the earth, you got to face it. You're going to die anyway. Okay? So whether or not you die on the face of the earth is not the issue. The issue is whether or not you live forever. And so he says, I'll guarantee you live forever, but some of you are going to die in the process. Okay? And so this is the idea. He's going to preserve them, but it's the idea of preserving faith. He says, I am coming soon. Hold to what you have. Let no one rob you of your crown. Okay? And so then he goes on to say, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, never to leave it. And we have the expression in English, a pillar of the church, and this is where it comes from. But in the ancient world, pillars were what actually held up buildings. Today, pillars are largely decorative. But in the ancient world, pillars were what in fact held up the temple. And he says, I will inscribe on the victor the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem which comes down from heaven from my God, and my own name. Notice the Trinitarian thing. The name of my God, which would be Yahweh, Elohim, any of the names. And this idea, and the name of the city of my God, which is the New Jerusalem. The church is the New Jerusalem. Okay, so that's the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's the thing of the church. And finally, my own name. And you remember the angel that's speaking to John and delivering these letters is in fact Jesus. So it's a Trinitarian reference, Father, Son, and Spirit. He says, you who have ears, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Now, Philadelphia, as I mentioned, was one of these Greek missionary cities. And in the big quake they had was in the year 17. And this earthquake leveled all of these cities. Okay, all the cities we're mentioning here were leveled in this. But Philadelphia is the one that went on with the aftershocks. And so what the letter is playing on is this idea of being, in or out of the city. And also the thing that's going on here is the fact that everything they're doing, they seem to be weak and everything, but everything they're doing is good. And remember, this was only seen, I think it was the second letter, the letter to Smyrna. Smyrna, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong, just good. And Philadelphia, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong, there's just good. They're going under a difficult time, but everything about Philadelphia is good. Now, the last one is Laodicea. And before I talk about Laodicea, much like Ephesus, the physical place of Laodicea is a spectacular experience. You're coming across the desert in Turkey. It's a very flat area. And as you get within a certain distance, there is in the distance what appears to be a mountain. In fact, it appears to be ice cream. It is stark white. I mean, white like you cannot imagine, and it is glistening. And those of you who've been to Yellowstone Park know that where they have those pools, the calcium goes over and it makes it very white. And then, of course, the water flowing over it, it keeps it glistening. That's what this is. Now, this has been going on for centuries. So it rises like what appears to be a mountain, and it is a series of thousands of pools. that go down the side of the mountain in this warm water. And one of the things to know about really hot temperatures like we have in Turkey, there are two things that are very satisfying in really hot temperatures. One is to get into very hot water, hot springs, because when you get out, the air is cooler, okay? And the other thing that's satisfying is to get into cooler water, because that cools you off. This water is the temperature of the air. It's probably in the 80s, 90s. And so it's very, let's say, unsatisfying. And we're going to see a reference to that. Remember this, I wish you were hot or cold, but because you're neither, that's where we hit the reference. So these are the words of the Amen, the faithful true witness, the beginning of God's creation. Okay, so these are the words of God. I know your works. You are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were either hot or cold. But because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. One of the things, and probably where most people know this, is from like Alcoholics Anonymous. Like the key to an alcoholic suddenly discovering that something has to be done is when everything falls apart. Okay? Now, if you never reach that point, you can be what they call a functioning alcoholic and never really know anything. And you never correct it at all. And it's because you never have this disastrous thing. Well, the same thing's true in a spiritual life. There are people who lead very holy lives like this, people who just go down the middle, and there are people who go down. And great saints are found in the ascendancy and the descendancy. So if you take a descendancy person, St. Augustine. St. Augustine woke up one day and said, my God, I'm going to hell. And so he, but we have all kinds of people like this in our history. Another example is the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola. At a certain moment, he realized. And Francis of Assisi, although he was a very innocent man, suddenly was called to this catastrophic holiness. And once called to that, he looked like his life was terrible. I think it's really funny that when Mother Teresa died and they began to examine her memoirs, people began to suspect she wasn't quite as holy as she was because she was depressed and she saw these things wrong with her. That's true of saints. The only person who sees a saint's holiness is someone else. If I see my own holiness, it's a good sign I'm not a saint. That's really one of the things you can watch. If I were to ever write a book for you about how holy I am, okay, it probably means I'm not a saint. Okay, I know many of you are surprised, but anyway, it says. So he says, "I'll spit you out of my mouth," and that's again, it's the idea of the really, you rise to holiness or you sink to evil, and either thing will match you. St. Augustine says there's two ways to learn the success of living with God. He says, number one, to live God's rule and to find out how successful it is, or to ignore God's rule and find out it's a disaster. Either one will show you, either one will show you. He says, you say, I am rich, I've made my fortune, I have no need of anything. Not realize then that you are a pitiful wretch, poor, blind, and naked. The first thing, I've made my fortune. Do you remember in the second city, he says that you are poor although you're rich? Because their poverty is a result of what they've suffered for the faith. Well, in this city, their riches are the fact that they are not admitting they're believers. So he says, you look rich, but in fact, you're impoverished. Okay? And this idea of poor, blind, and naked refer to, I told you that this is a mountain that rises up there, and so they have some of the best wool in the world there. And it's because they raise it on the high area. I think the wool is better the colder the climate in which sheep are raised. And so they